thanks very much. One of the wonderful things about going last is I can actually skip over a few things because you'll see, even though Brian, Lee, and I didn't prepare our talks together, there are some similarities in the slides we've used. So thank you very much. I'll also have to confess that I am an academic economist, and so I do spend a lot of my time working with data and working with economic theories. But I also am part of our Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University, which means I do this stuff ultimately to inform public policy as well as to inform myself, my colleagues, and my students. So actually, I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to speak before an audience of prominent policymakers who can take some of this information and put it into practice and hopefully put it to very good use in the cause. So what I was planning to do was talk a bit about the story of NAFTA and start out with its glory days of its infancy. But I think NAFTA now is starting to hit its adolescence. And adolescence, as the father of a 17-year-old, isn't always the easiest time. In fact, at least the Canadians here know, we use the term NAFTA as a shorthand for something that actually started at least in 1989 with the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. And then 5 years later, NAFTA came along and really added Mexico to the existing Canada-U.S. agreement. But you can even go back farther in time if you wanted. The cartoon I have up here is actually from the 1890s. It's a Canadian election cartoon for Sir John A. Macdonald's campaign against free trade with the United States. So the idea there was to build a big wall protecting the Canadian economy, Canadian farmers and Canadian manufacturers from these American manufacturers on the other side of the wall. So actually, 1989 was a big change. It was around the same time that the Berlin Wall started to come down, but the early 1990s was also when this tariff wall came down between Canada and the United States, and so it was a big change. So, but I will use NAFTA as a shorthand for all of those trade liberalization initiatives. So, as Brian Lee's already told you, NAFTA did two things. It both increased and it transformed North American trade. And I'll still use the word trade because companies still are trading with each other. We even use the word trade when we talk about exchange between people within the economy. But I know we're not talking about traditional trade. We're not talking about trading maple syrup for cars. We're talking about trading cars and car parts, often for cars and car parts. And so that's one of the things that really happened. It was really a process that was accelerated under the NAFTA and the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. It certainly is true that trade grew quickly. It grew more quickly than the GDP, so it made both the Canadian-American economies and then the Mexican economy more open, more trade-dependent. Trade also grew the most quickly in the parts of the economy that were liberalized the most. In other words, the more the tariffs came down, the faster trade grew. So the policy worked the way it was supposed to work in terms of the amount of trade. And of course, it didn't, as we already know, it didn't just increase trade, it transformed trade. Turned that trade from old-fashioned trade of apples for oranges to apples for apples trade. And again, this term that our colleague Stephen Blank gets credit for, I think, of making things together, or what Glenn Hodgson at the Conference Board of Canada calls integrative trade, trade where we're actually integrating the economies more. So you've already seen this picture, so I don't need to go on more about it, but you can see how popular it is. So let me use my backup one, which is this one. Some of you may have actually seen this already if you flew into SeaTac Airport to get here. So this is actually, if you take the shuttle trains that take you between the terminals at the SeaTac Airport, if you're like me, again, I grew up in Canada, so I still have enough of my Canadian shyness that I tend to look down at my shoes or the wall when I'm taking the trains. And so I read these little signs. And the part I found interesting was that these were manufactured in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania by Bombardier Transportation. And of course, most of you probably know Bombardier Transportation is this Canadian-based, Montreal-based transportation company, maker of trains and planes and even automobiles in some cases, but also jet skis. Operations, aerospace operations in Mexico, operations in Plattsburgh, New York, with parts coming across the border. So it's not just the auto industry, manufacturing in general, and I'm sure most manufacturers can come up with the descriptions of this. Cases where businesses are importing their inputs from other manufacturers, making something and then often re-exporting it. So the key thing about this is that imports are often a key ingredient into exporting. And we sometimes forget that imports are as important as exports, especially if you think exports are important. I often tell my students, remember, when people went on the voyages of discovery, 1492, etc., going to find the route to the Orient, they weren't going to get to the Orient to sell stuff. They were going there to buy stuff, import, spices, imports. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. So I think most economists and most observers agree that there were these two changes due to free trade, and in the glory years, these things worked very well. So really, around 2000, 2001, the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement did start to hit its teen years, and we did start to see some difficulties. Most economists and most observers have noted that the growth of trade started to slow down. There was less of advance in this in trade in fostered integration, less trade in intermediate goods. And I've been doing some work on this myself, digging way down deep into trade data and looking at trade in intermediate goods, because it's the intermediate goods, those parts, components, things that are getting built into something else, that's all part of this new kind of what I call still trade, and Patrick doesn't call it trade, but exchange between businesses. So something went wrong. We're in these definite teen years. Now, where people start to disagree a little bit is on explaining why there's something what went wrong. There are probably three main thoughts about why trade has hit some difficulties. One of them's got to do with what Patrick Lee has already mentioned, which is border thickening. The idea that after 9/11, increased waiting time at the border, increased costs related to security, have made it more difficult to cross the border and have hurt trade. And I actually have written a book on this with my colleague Steve Wilberman. In fact, I think we'd even, with some modesty, say that we wrote the book on it, because it's the only book on it. But we quite carefully documented what happened after 9/11 and found significant 10, 20% drops in some cases, particularly in Canadian exports to the United States, which we think are largely attributable to increased security at the border. And there's quite a strong academic literature in this area. Some people think it's actually other things that are more to blame. Competition from China. China joined the WTO fully in December of 2001. Trade from China starts to take, U.S. imports from China really take off starting in 2001, the same time that NAFTA seems to be stalling or slowing down. There's probably something to that. And then other people actually pick on something else, which is regulatory impediments to integration. Just one example of that are the rules of origin. Those of you who are familiar with NAFTA know that if you want to get the NAFTA preferential duty, you have to prove that your good actually originates in North America. And that's not always easy to do. It can be very complicated. In fact, it's so complicated that some exporters who could prove that they qualify for the NAFTA lower tariff do not even bother to fill out the paperwork. So they have their customers pay the higher non-NAFTA tariff. That's a sign that there's a problem, that the system is too complicated. Of course, the Europeans don't have this problem because they have a common external tariff. So they don't need to prove rules of origin. We have to worry because if Canada and Mexico and the United States all have different tariffs on items coming, say, from Japan, then if we don't stop and check things in the internal North American border, then we create an incentive for people for goods from Japan to enter through the lowest tariff country and come in through the back door. So what are the policy responses to this? Well, I always tell my student that being an economist is a little bit like being a physician, that what we're supposed to do is find ways to diagnose what the problem is and suggest solutions. So we take the vital signs of the patient, diagnose the problem, and suggest solutions. So I think we all agree on the vital signs of what's happening, but we disagree on the diagnosis of what the problem is, whether it's China, border thickening, or regulation. So, and here, by the way, is my border thickening picture. And again, the Ambassador Bridge is on my mind too, having read the news just the last day or so. You see the trucks lined up, and of course, some of you may know that these trucks line up off the bridge, all the way off the bridge apron, all through the main street of Windsor, Ontario, which is one of the main reasons why there's the desire to have more bridge capacity in that area. So the good news is, though, that even if we can't be sure exactly what the cause of this illness is, the suggested cure that's out there right now from the Obama, Harper, Beyond the Border initiative really actually will cover all the bases, because it has a perimeter security type of initiative and a regulatory cooperation component. And so the perimeter security initiative is going to do the kinds of things that other speakers have mentioned, which is move things away from the border, try to get so that the border crossings are actually more efficient, pre-screen, pre-clear as much trade crossing the border as possible. And if you've heard Ambassador Jacobson, you've probably heard him talk about, was it the RBGs, the really bad guys or gals, and the job of trying to find them, I think he describes as trying to find a needle in a haystack. And when you're trying to find needles in haystacks, as you've probably heard, what you want to do is take as much of the hay out of that stack first, so the needle is easier to find. And that's a lot of what will be done by pre-clearance, trusted trade programs that will be going into place at the border. Also, infrastructure at the border is being enhanced. We've built more infrastructure at the Blaine crossing. I know that on the southern border, I've heard that there are private toll roads being built, which will enhance access to the border. And we haven't really, on the northern border, done enough, I don't think, with the idea of toll roads or even toll crossings, other than the FAST program. Now, given that this is primarily a state or maybe provinces audience, I did want to focus some of my suggestions of what might be coming in the future at the state level. I should say, you've probably heard this, that the action plan should be out soon for the Beyond the Border initiative. So I'll probably speculate as to things that I would put in it if I was working on it, but you should soon be hearing what really is in it. One comment I would make is a lot of the work I've done with the Border Policy Research Institute repeatedly shows that the border in Michigan is not the same as the border in Montana. The problems and the solutions, therefore, are different. So, for instance, one of the things we find is that at Detroit, a lot of the crossing is from goods related to the auto industry. The trucks, the parts, and things that are crossing are part of large multinational corporations that have huge economies of scale and can work with the border quite efficiently. Where I am, just north of here, about an hour and a half north of here, a lot more of the trade is smaller businesses, medium-sized businesses. They can't always fill an entire truck, let alone dozens of trucks. So they end up having to ship with less than truckload, and that doesn't make it very easy to qualify for the FAST program. So FAST doesn't really work very well in that region. So actually, our Border Policy Research Institute did an analysis suggesting, based on computer simulation, that it would be worth trying the idea of making the FAST lane open to anybody if nobody else from FAST was in it. And that has now actually been accepted as a pilot project by Customs and Border Protection. So at the state level, be looking for how your border is different. Use the institutes that exist to help you with that, and advocate for policy that's right for your border location, because one size fits all is not the right solution. I would argue to continue and be involved in infrastructure planning, and again, the state of Michigan shows just how much states can have a say in what happens at the border. Infrastructure for the gateways that connect our border to our economic centers are often under state control, and we know that's the case of what's been happening with the connection between Windsor and Detroit at the Ambassador Bridge. In connection with that, I would again encourage you to never forget how important imports are to creating jobs and exports. It's not a plus and minus, that bringing in imports is important for your production. And the auto industry saw that after 9/11, when Canadian parts from Canadian manufacturers couldn't get into the United States, and so you had U.S. automakers shutting down all through the United States because they couldn't get their inputs. And so those jobs were threatened. There are lots of other issues that we can talk about. I think one of them that I don't want to get into too much is services, banking. We've talked a lot about goods, but I think a lot of times states are involved in regulation of banking services. TD Bank now has actually more branches in the United States than it does in Canada. And they also have the name on what I used to know as, I guess, the Boston Gardens. Areas like communications regulation, education, research, migration, the creation of cross-border clusters, these are all areas that states could get very much involved in. Now, I'll actually end with just a few comments about something I think we could, specifically I've been working on, that I think is important to get working on, which is preparing the groundwork for eventual movement towards a more harmonized tariff system. We don't want to go there yet, but we should at least have a road that could take us there. Right now, for instance, tariffs in North America, classifications aren't even the same. They're the same at what's called the 6-digit level, but at the 10-digit level, they're very different. So we can't even compare or even contemplate having similar tariffs like the Europeans do for third countries, because we don't even have a similar classification system. I don't see any cost to getting a similar classification system. We should move in that direction. We get a better idea of just how similar our tariffs are. I could only actually, when I measured them, only measure about half of them to compare them between the two countries. We could move towards common entry documents. And in fact, if we wanted to, we could actually move towards having particularly both Canada and the United States, having identical tariffs set at 0 for all other countries. Doing that, giving up all that tariff revenue, would actually cost only 1% of federal government revenues in the United States. Now, I know this is probably not the best time to be talking about giving up any federal revenue, but I think the increased economic activity that would come from that kind of a change would quickly make up, in terms of economic growth, the lost tariff revenue. So there are a lot of things we could do at fairly low cost, and I'm hoping that these things will be part of the action plan, which we should all be watching for, because it should be out, I think, soon. Anyway, thank you very much for listening.